Parshas Chukas, I'd like to share with you three Rashis that we're going to try to connect all of the three Rashis together, even though the three Rashis are discussing different things. The Torah tells us at the beginning of Parshas Chukas that there's a way to purify a human being who has come in contact with death, and that's through the ashes of the Para Aduma. And that's the first section. It's chapter 19 of the book of Numbers. It deals completely with that process of purification. Why it is discussed specifically at this point in the Torah is discussed by a number of commentaries, and it has to do with the fact that Parshas Chukas is bringing us to the borders of Eretz Yisrael, and we have to begin preparing the Jewish militia for warfare. And part of warfare is encounters with death. So this is a very natural place for it to be, even though it doesn't seem that way at face value. But then, right afterwards, at the very beginning of chapter 20, the Torah continues its narrative of the story of the Jewish people in the desert in their 40th year of their sojourn in the desert. And the Torah says, "Vayavou b'nei Yisrael kol ha'edam midbartzin b'chodesh harishon." It's the 40th year. They come in the month of Nisan to the Tzin desert. Vayeshev ha'am b'Kadesh, and the nation dwells. They all encamp in a place called Kadesh. Vatomot sham Miriam vatikaver sham. Miriam dies in that place, and she is buried in that place. So Miriam is together with her brother Aharon and her brother Moshe. All three of them die before making it into the Promised Land. And we've talked about this in years past, what Miriam doesn't seem to have deserved to die. But anyway, that was another discussion. But Velohaya Mayim La'eda, and then the Torah switches gears after discussing Miriam's death and her burial. There was no water for the congregation. Vayikahalu al Moshe al Aharon, and the people gathered upon Moshe and Aaron and started to complain, we need water. That's all we're going to see today in the text. Now let's take a look at Rashi. Vatomot sham Miriam, Miriam died there. Lama nismecha parshat mitat Miriam leparshat para aduma. Rashi, quoting the Medrash, says, why does the Torah create an adjacency between the laws of the red heifer, which purifies the dead, or those who have come in contact with the dead, and why is that connected to Miriam's death? Lomar lecha, this is to teach you, ma korbanot mechaprin, that just like sacrifices atone, af mitat tzadikim mechaperet, so too does the death of the righteous atone. So just like the ashes of the para aduma, which is a type of sacrifice, because the Torah calls it a chatat, so almost, which is the same term for a sin offering in the temple, and that atones, that alleviates tumah, it alleviates impurity. So too, when a tzaddik dies or passes from the world, that creates an alleviation of impurity. It helps create atonement. Now the commentaries are all bothered by this medrash that Rashi quotes, because if you wanted to compare Miriam's death to a sacrifice, put it next to a real sacrifice, a real korban. The para aduma, the red heifer, is not slaughtered and placed on the altar. The red heifer is slaughtered outside the temple by the Mount of Olives, overlooking the entrance to the temple. And it is completely combusted to ash outside the temple. It's not a sacrifice, it's akin to a sacrifice. So the question that the commentaries ask is, okay, it's a beautiful sentiment. Just like sacrifices atone, so too does the death of the righteous atone. But if that's the message, then talk about a real korban, not about a pseudo korban like the para aduma. Why is that adjacency created? So that's something that we need to address. I want us to take a look at the source number 3. Rashi then says, Vatomot sham Miriam, that Miriam passed away. And Rashi tells us, Afhi b'neshika meta, that Miriam died with the kiss of death. Has anyone ever heard of mitat nishika, the kiss of death? Aaron died the same way. Now, how do I know that Aaron died the same way? Because with Aaron's death, which is also recorded in this parsha, it says, Al pi Hashem, by the mouth of God. And our sages tell us that whenever you find the term by the mouth of God, it means that God kissed Aharon and caused his death through kissing him. Now, what that means is, it's not very clear from that terminology, but it means the kiss of death means it's a very positive term. Which means it's a painless death, it's an instantaneous death, and that transitions immediately from life to death. There's no painful transition that one has to undergo. It's very, very peaceful, it's very, very painless, just like getting a kiss on the cheek, and then you're gone. That's what is described as mitat neshika, the death by the kiss of God. And as we'll see, the Gemara talks about the different types of death that occur to an individual. But we'll get to that in just a second. Rashi just then continues and he says, Umipnei malo nemar ba'al pi Hashem. If it says in the context of Aharon that he died with al pi Hashem, which means by the kiss of God, then why does it not say the same thing for Miriam? She'eno derech kavod shel ma'ala. Because it's not considered to be honorable for God to say that he kissed Miriam. God is male, Miriam's female. It has some kind of undertone or connotation that we would rather avoid. And therefore, we derive it from textual connections, but doesn't say so explicitly that it was Al Pi Hashem. Okay? So that's the next Rashi. And then I want to show you the third and final Rashi that we're going to see today, which is source number 4, V'lo haya mayim la'eda. Immediately after Miriam is dead and buried, there is no water for the congregation. Mikan shekol 40 shana haya lahem habe'er bizchut Miriam. This teaches us that for the entire time that Miriam was alive during those 40 years in the desert, the water flowed for them in the zechut of Miriam. It was because of Miriam's righteousness that the water flowed. And as soon as she died and her righteousness ceased from the world, the water stopped flowing, but only temporarily. It then came back, as the Gemara says, B'zchut Aharon, B'zchut Moshe. It came back in the merit of Aaron and Moshe. But that's the reason why the story of no water occurs immediately after Miriam's death. So we have what Rashi creates as a connection. He connects A to B and he connects B to C. He says the reason why the Para Aduma is connected to Miriam's death is because just like sacrifices like the Para Aduma atone, so too does the death of the righteous atone. That's the connection from A to B. What's the connection from B to C? Is that as a result of Miriam's dying, and she was the one responsible for the rock giving forth its water, the water ceased to flow. Why is Miriam connected to water? Well, we know that Miriam's ultimate kindness to her brother Moshe was by the water of the Nile, so that's one connection. Water represents chesed. Miriam's attribute is chesed, and there's a number of commentaries about that idea that Miriam is directly related to the water of the well. But the question that we're going to try and answer is, how do we connect all three together? How do we connect A to B to C? And what do all three portions have to do with each other? So the first thing that I wanted to share with you in order to answer this question is a snippet from the Shemi Shmuel, who quotes his father, the Avnei Nezer, Rabbi Avram of Sachachav, Rabbi Avram Bornstein of Sachachav, the famous great Avnei Nezer. He says as follows. He says, Inyan mei meriva, what went wrong? Why did Moshe strike the rock and not just speak to the rock as we know he was supposed to do? So he quotes his father as saying, D'mimasha amruzal tashmishei kedusha nignazin v'tashmishei mitzvah nizrakin. He says there's a Gemara in Masechet Megillah that says that there's a difference between two different kinds of holy artifacts. There is what's called tashmishei kedusha, holy artifacts, and there's tashmishei mitzvah artifacts. What's the difference between the two? What's an example of a holy artifact? Something that has a Torah, something that has God's name written on it, a mezuzah, a pair of tefillin. Those you're not allowed to discard when you're done with them. Even after they wear out, what do you have to do with them? You bury them, you put them into a geniza, okay? But tashmishay mitzvah, when you're done with the lulav on Sukkos, what do you do with it? You can throw it away. Now, there's a minhag to use it for something else afterwards, but that's only a minhag. But technically, you're allowed to throw away something that does not have inherent holiness, but it was used for a mitzvah. You can just throw that away. A pair of tzitzis is the same thing. Someone just asked me, what does he do with his old tzitzis? Technically, you just wrap it, put it in a bag, and throw it away. You don't have to put tzitzis into a geniza. You don't have to put a yarmulke into geniza, right? You don't have to, right? So that's the difference between tashmishay mitzvah and tashmishay kedusha. Okay? But what's the difference between the two? What does that have to do with the rock? Mizen yireh shetashmishay kedusha nish'ar bahem roshem hakedusha. He says when you have a worn-out Sefer Torah, there's a remnant of holiness that is left in that artifact. The tashmishay mitzvah ein nish'ar bahem klum. But when it comes to something that was used for a mitzvah, once the mitzvah is done, Sukkos is over, there's no remnant of holiness that adheres within the esrog or the lulav. Moshe Rabbeinu machmat an v'tanuto chashav et hasela shehu atzmo hatzur shebechorev l'tashmish mitzvah she'eino nish'ar bo roshem. Moshe looked at the rock, saw that it stopped flowing water after Miriam died, and assumed that there was no remnant of holiness left in the rock. And therefore, the only way to regenerate the water flow was by doing something drastic, such as hitting it. He therefore thought that just like I started the water flow 40 years ago by hitting the rock in Parshat Bishalach, I have to do the same in this case by hitting it all over again. Uve'emet hayat tashmish kedusha shenish'ar bo roshem ve'in tzarich lahakoto rak b'dibur bilvad. Ad kan devarav hakedoshim. So my father says the Shem Yishmol, that what Moshe's mistake was, is what he didn't realize, is that the rock that had stopped flowing water was like not tashmishay mitzvah, where there's no more inherent holiness, but there was a remnant of holiness left in the rock, and all he had to do was speak to it in order to get it to flow the water that was still, the holiness that was still running through it on a subdued level. So that's the entire commentary that I wanted you to see. Essentially, what is being suggested is that Moshe made an error in judgment based on his misunderstanding of what caused the stoppage of the flow of water. He thought that the water had completely stopped and there was nothing inherently left in this rock, and therefore we had to start the process all over again. Just like 40 years ago, I hit the rock in order to get it to flow water, I have to hit it again now. His mistake was not realizing that there was still some remnant of holiness in the rock, even though it stopped flowing temporarily. All he needed really to do was to speak to it to get it for that latent holiness to start flowing again. And here's what I want to explain using this as a launch pad, and why Moshe made this mistake and what the error was based on. But in order for us to understand it, we have to go back to an understanding of what death is and what tum'ah is. We know that when a person passes away, what happens? The neshama separates from the body. That's what we call death. But if the soul separates from the body, then what is left in the corpse? What is left in the corpse? The corpse is essentially an empty shell. And so the question then becomes, why is it that there is a spiritual phenomenon which lingers upon an empty shell of just a purely physical item? And that physical, or that spiritual phenomenon is something that we call tum'ah. We call ritual impurity. How does ritual impurity adhere within something that is purely just tissue, that has no remnant left of any spiritual component at all? So the answer to that question is that when a normal person passes from the world, there is not a complete separation of body and soul. There is mostly a separation between body and soul. And what happens, the Gemara describes over 900 different ways to die, because depending upon how a person lived their life will define how a person dies. What does the Talmud mean by that? Well, the Gemara says that there is the most difficult way to die is through a process of as slow asphyxiation, where it is very difficult for the soul to depart, and it departs with great difficulty over a protracted period of time. And the Gemara compares that to trying to pull a thorn out of a ball of wool, or a ball of cotton. If you would imagine for a second, you've got a thorn in a ball of cotton, and you try to pull the thorn out, and the strands of cotton cling and make it very difficult to have a clean separation. By contrast, the Gemara says, the cleanest way, or the simplest or smoothest way to die is like pulling a hair out of a glass of milk. You skim it off the top and it comes out smoothly without any remnant. And what is the Gemara trying to communicate to us? When a tzaddik passes from the world, and this is what really the definition of mitat nishika is, there is a clean break, a clean separation between body and soul. Most people do not reach that level of holiness that when it is time for them to die, the soul cleanly breaks from the body. And the reason is because since we focus so much of our lives on our physical interests, when it is time for our neshama to depart, there's always a remnant of the neshama that lingers, that wants to stick around. Okay? And therefore, that diminished aspect of the soul that lingers by the body is what causes tumah, is what causes ritual impurity. Because it is a diminished state of spiritual essence that lingers in the body, and any diminished state of spiritual essence is what we call tumah. Okay? And that can be traced throughout the laws of the Torah wherever we find the concept of tumah. Now, if that's the case, that's how we define tumah. When a tzaddik passes from the world, the corpse contains no remnant whatsoever of the neshama, because the neshama has completely broken free and there's no desire of any aspect of the soul to linger by its body, because the person during their lifetime was completely focused on spiritual development and growth, and therefore when the neshama has the opportunity to leave, it leaves completely. And that is the reason why our sages tell us that when a righteous person dies, their corpse does not impart ritual impurity, because there is no remnant of the soul whatsoever. And therefore we have stories in the Gemara of someone like Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, who passed away, and a great Kohen who was alive said, if I had been at that funeral, I would have participated and would have been one of the pallbearers. Because his point is that the body of a tzaddik does not impart any ritual impurity, and therefore a Kohen doesn't have to worry about becoming tameh. This is the idea that is represented by the ashes of the para aduma. What is the para aduma? You take a vibrant living animal, you slaughter it, you kill it, and you reduce it to ash. And what you're essentially saying is you're breaking away any aspect of its previous existence as a living creature by reducing it to complete ash. And in that process, what you're doing in a symbolic way is representing the complete separation of body from soul. And that's how you alleviate tum'ah. That's how you alleviate impurity, which is to say, there is a complete breakage. This ash represents just the pure physicality of the cow without any remnant of a life force whatsoever. We sprinkle that on the person, and that's supposed to represent the breakage of any remnant of tumah, which is a result of a small spiritual remnant that clings to physicality, that clings to the body. That's the idea of the para aduma. Okay? Now, with that, we can understand why Miriam's death comes immediately afterwards. Because Miriam's death represents that same type of alleviation of impurity, because she died through mitat nishika. Her body did not impart any tumah. So therefore, just like the ashes of the para aduma represent the necessity for a clean break, the death of a tzaddik also represents that idea of the necessity for a clean break in order to alleviate that residual impurity that comes from that spiritual remnant of the soul clinging to the body. And now let's bring this to the story of the rock. What is the story of the rock? Moshe thought that just like Miriam's death was a complete departure of the spiritual essence of Miriam from her body, so too when the rock stopped flowing forth its water, it represented a complete spiritual break of that life force of the rock that was flowing forth with water from the rock itself. And therefore he needed to start the process all over again by striking it. What was his mistake? His mistake was not realizing that it wasn't just the virtues of one human being, Miriam, that caused the water to flow forth, but rather there was still the attachment of holiness that remained from the entire nation of Israel. That remnant of holiness that remained from the entire nation was enough to cause the latent holiness of that rock to begin flowing again without having to start the process all over again. But his mistake was born from his observation of Miriam's death, that he thought that Miriam's death represented a complete cessation of holiness from within the rock. Just like her soul completely departed, so too her holiness, which imbued the rock with life to give forth water, completely departed from this world. His mistake was not realizing that it wasn't just her contribution alone, but it was rather because of his virtues, Aaron's virtues, the nation's virtues that caused the rock to still have this latent holiness. And had he better understood the greatness of the Jewish people, he would not have felt it necessary to hit the rock. He could have just spoken to the rock. But what that does, what we've created is this philosophical connection between the Para Aduma, the death of Miriam through Mitat Neshika, and the mistake that Moshe Rabbeinu made by hitting the rock instead of speaking to the rock. And now all three stories are linked together. And one of the things that perhaps a moral lesson that we can learn is that no one person can be deemed to be indispensable and responsible for all of the miracles of the world taking place. Even with the death of a righteous person like Miriam, it's possible for the Jewish people to endure and to be able to bring back the waters of holiness and vitality to the world. Any questions or comments? I've left you speechless.